Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 41, printed in Part D of House Report number 118-216, offered by Ms. Greene of Georgia.
My amendment is number 42. I ask unanimous consent to withdraw amendment number 41.
Without objection. March with 42. It is now in order to consider amendment number 42, printed in Part D of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 42, printed in Part D of House Report number 118-216, offered by Ms. Greene of Georgia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Greene, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My amendment would prohibit funds from being provided to assist Ukraine. Over a year and a half ago, Russia invaded Ukraine, but now the United States has basically taken over Ukraine and is fighting a proxy war in Ukraine that we never voted for. We are funding their government. We are paying for their small businesses. We are paying their farmers. We are handing military equipment and weapons over to Ukraine and paying for their war. According to the Congressional Research Service, in 2022, the United States provided $113 billion in total assistance to Ukraine. Every single year, the United States spends billions of dollars on foreign aid, much more than any other country. Ukraine has now taken the top spot. The $50 billion state and foreign operations bill includes an unspecified funding amount for Ukraine. Section 7046B2 would make funds available for Ukraine to support the ability of the government of Ukraine to defend their sovereignty and withstand the impacts of Russia's invasion, combat corruption, and promote transparency and democracy. This is nothing more than a blank check for Ukraine that Joe Biden's State Department will get to write. And even more dangerously, they get to waive oversight, claiming national security. All this will do is fuel another never-ending war and push the United States even closer to the brink of nuclear holocaust. After Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan wars, haven't we had enough of taxpayer-funded state and foreign operations? They tell us we have to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over here. But paying for wars in foreign countries will eventually have consequences on our country. And we will bring the war to America, and we will end up fighting them here when countries have had enough of the United States. After a year and a half of being engaged in this conflict, the American people no longer support the additional assistance to Ukraine. My amendment will help stop this brutal war and help push for peace in Ukraine, which should be our ultimate goal. Mr. Chair, I reserve.
The gentlewoman from California reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition? I'm sorry, the Georgia reserves. For what purpose, Ms. Lee, do you seek recognition?
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Russia's brutal and unprovoked attack on Ukraine is not just a threat to Ukraine and its neighbors, but to the world. If Russia succeeds in its aggression, other unprovoked attacks are inevitable. As my colleague Representative Hoyer said last week on the House floor, we are locked in a struggle between freedom and fascism, democracy and despotism, might and right. The war in Ukraine is that struggle manifest. Ukraine's democracy is being undermined every single day. Entire cities have been demolished. Women and girls are being sexually abused by Russian soldiers. Hospitals and schools, which should be safe havens, are being intentionally attacked. Thousands of innocent children and their families have been brutally murdered. Millions of Ukrainians have been forced to flee their country. Colleagues, we must continue to ensure that Ukraine has the funding and support it needs to defend itself and that vulnerable people continue to receive life-saving assistance. And I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from California reserves. The gentlewoman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to yield 1 minute to my friend from Illinois, Congresswoman Miller.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Congresswoman Greene. Joe Biden has forced Americans to foot the bill for hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine while our southern border is being invaded by terrorists, drug cartels, gangs, and human traffickers. I oppose sending any additional money to Ukraine oligarchs in a proxy war that we are being dragged into because Ukraine was paying the Biden family $1 million a year in cash. Americans deserve a spending bill that puts America first by securing our border and putting us back on the path to energy independence, which was achieved by the Trump administration. I want to thank Congresswoman Greene for offering this amendment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back.
I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 1.5 minutes now to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sadly, the world is in a conflict we did not choose between dictators with rule of gun opposing democracies with rule of law. War criminal Putin began the current murderous conflict invading Ukraine, shocked to find out that Ukrainians courageously resisted. The brave Ukrainian people are an inspiration to the world as they know Putin falsely claims Ukraine does not exist, as Putin is trying to reassemble the evil empire of the Soviet Union. Fellow dictators clearly see the conflict as dictator of democracy as North Korean Kim Jong-un joins Putin. The Chinese Communist Party is conducting the largest peacetime military buildup in world history. The regime in Tehran builds drones for Putin to murder Ukrainian civilians as they plan death to America, death to Israel. We must stop the dictators today, or there will be a direct threat to American families tomorrow. We must always remember, of all things, Pearl Harbor. We must remember 9/11. For these reasons, I oppose the amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman, I believe, yields back.
I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It needs to be recognized that we represent the American people. And the polling shows very clearly the American people do not support continuing to fund a war in a foreign country when our own country has been having a war waged on us by the Mexican cartels. 55% of Americans say the U.S. Congress should not authorize additional funding to Ukraine. 51% say the U.S. has already done enough to help Ukraine. Americans demand their hard-earned tax dollars be used to secure our own southern border and stop the Mexican cartel's war on America that's killing 300 Americans every single day, that's human trafficking, sex trafficking. You want to talk about women and children? We should care about the women and children that are being trafficked at our own southern border, not pay to defend another foreign country and worry about another country who, by the way, is not the 51st state. We only have 50 states in the United States of America, and our tax dollars should pay to defend our states here. I urge the House to adopt my amendment, and that, Mr. Chair, I yield the rest of my time.
The gentlewoman from Georgia yields.
I yield, Mr. Chairman, I yield the remaining time to my remaining time to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Speaker, when Ronald Reagan stood in front of the Berlin Wall and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, take down this wall," he did so not because we were in opposition to just the Soviet Union and Russians. He did so because we were in opposition to authoritarianism. We were in opposition to communism. Now, that wall fell, but it didn't fall because the Soviet Union took it down. It fell because they merely didn't shoot the people who were doing so. But when it fell, as a result of Ronald Reagan's words and a call to the world, the line between authoritarianism and democracy marched all the way to the border of Russia. Right now, today, Putin has told us straight up He wants to move the line of authoritarianism back. He wants to reclaim that land, not just Ukraine, but Poland, Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, Eastern Europe, and the Baltics. We must support democracy or freedom, or yes, if we don't, ours is at risk. Ronald Reagan's words are meaningless if we allow Russia to reestablish authoritarianism and move that line of democracy back to where the Soviet Union had claimed Eastern Europe and had imposed authoritarianism on people's lives. Now, this is not just an American mission. The world is with us. Democracies are with us. This is a chart that shows the amount of contribution of the total aggregate of all aid. This is up on my website, by the way, my official website. If you go there and click on Ukraine, you'll see these, along with a report that verifies this information. The United States is not the major contributor of total aid. But what's more important, when you get to military aid, the United States is less than half of all military aid. The world's democracies are standing against Russia for democracy, against authoritarianism, and the United States, the light of the world for democracy, needs to be there and needs to support the Ukrainian people against these atrocities. If you go to my website, you'll see the documentation that supports this. We are $42 billion. The rest of our democracy allies are over $50 billion. We need to stay in the fight by supplying Ukrainians the weapons that they need for them to be in the fight for democracy. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise as a designee of the gentlelady from Texas, Mrs. Granger, and I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, first, something that has to be recognized on this floor is my colleague from Georgia who's presenting this amendment has been transparent, open, and clear from day one. And that is something that is not always seen in this body, and I think we need to recognize that. And I think that's something that has to be respected, regardless of if one agrees or disagrees with her. And I think that's something that has to be recognized. Now, I just want to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the bill. I clearly recognize my colleagues, and it's not only her, frustration about the administration's lack of transparency, lack of articulation, lack of a strategy, how the funds have been used, on the communication from A to Z. I get that. And so while there are no funds directed for the Ukraine in this bill, there are a lot of directives in this bill for accountability for any assistance going to Ukraine. And let me just take a moment to read the list of requirements that must be completed before one single penny would be used to go to Ukraine from this bill. A strategy, and this is now or later or whenever, a strategy within 90 days. We've not gotten that from the administration. In-person monitoring of all programs. Cost matching requirements, making sure that other donors must do more than the United States before one penny can go out. A certification that comprehensive oversight mechanisms are in place, a notification to Congress so we can assess, if any, of how those funds may be used, an obligation report every 90 days accounting for all monies provided, an oversight report every 90 days detailing any allegations of waste, fraud, and corruption and how those will be addressed. And finally, and I think this is key, all reports must be clearly posted on the internet so that every American can look where their taxpayer money is going. So the reason that I am so optimistic and so gung-ho about this bill is that we need to pass this bill in order to have requirements, these requirements in order to not have a blank check. I am looking at not only the short term, but also long term. We need to have accountability. We need conditions. We need oversight. We need to take away as much flexibility from the administration. That's precisely what we're attempting to do in this bill. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida yields back.